The history of human weaponry can be divided into two major stages. The first dates back to the early Homo species, when the arsenal consisted of stones, sharpened branches, and other simple tools serving multiple purposes. The development of techniques for working with glass-like materials such as flint and obsidian allowed the creation of full-fledged spears. These were mainly used for hunting but were also formidable weapons in human conflicts. In fact, they were far deadlier than the clubs that modern people love to imagine Paleolithic humans wielding. However, the second stage of weapon development began relatively recently, when humans mastered food production and started smelting non-ferrous metals. It was during the Copper and Bronze Ages that polished stone maces and daggers appeared, quickly evolving into the first swords. In other words, specialized tools for killing other humans were created. Over the following millennia, the variety of weapons only grew, taking on unique characteristics in different parts of the world. As I often quote the sociologist Erich Fromm, the number and intensity of wars are not constant values. They increase significantly as technological civilization advances and governmental power strengthens. When discussing weapon prices, it's important to start by addressing a common misconception. Many people view past economies through a modern lens. They come across medieval price lists, compare them to recorded incomes of craftsmen, and forget that the economy was not market-based but subsistence-based, and the Industrial Revolution had yet to occur. For most of history, about 90% of the population were peasants with no regular monetary income. During the summer, they harvested crops that served as both food and seed stock. Almost all surplus beyond what was needed for survival was paid as dues to the feudal lord, who owned the land. If the harvest was good and peasants had extra, they didn't rush to sell it for money. Barter was the dominant system, and goods were exchanged directly for necessities. Even coins were valued primarily for the weight of precious metal they contained. Most necessities, including clothing and footwear, were produced at home through domestic craftsmanship. Professional artisans, whose incomes are often cited in historical sources, were relatively rare. Even in the early 20th century, according to the 1908 industrial census, the total number of workers in the Russian Empire was only about 2 million, compared to a total population of around 160 million. So don't be too quick to judge historical prices based on the wages of a narrow professional class. Moreover, most such statistics come from the late Middle Ages, when cities were growing, urbanization was increasing, and craftsmanship was developing. But if we look at an earlier period, say the 10th century, we see a different picture. Converting weapon prices into modern money is nearly impossible because the purchasing power of the majority was close to zero. However, there is a clearer equivalent. With the shift to food production, human diets changed drastically. Animal-based foods were largely replaced by carbohydrate-rich but protein and fat-poor plant-based diets. This led to a decrease in average human height and the emergence of various diseases. The solution to this protein and fat deficiency came in the form of dairy consumption. And if you complain about lactose intolerance, consider a recent article in Nature that highlights an interesting fact. For thousands of years, people consumed dairy products despite lacking the genetic mutation that allows adults to digest lactose. Even today, many Asian populations, including Mongols, who generally do not produce the lactase enzyme, consume dairy regularly, despite widespread lactose intolerance. This very lactose, or milk sugar, is not the most valuable part of milk, and was often removed by fermenting dairy products. To absorb milk proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals, the lactase enzyme, granted to some European populations through mutation, is not necessary. Personally, I used to think I had lactose intolerance, but after increasing my dairy consumption, the unpleasant symptoms disappeared. Looks like if you cut dairy out of your diet, your body stops producing lactase. Though maybe ditching sunflower oil helped too, but that's another story. So, what's the point of all this? Well, a cow, still worth close to 100,000 rubles, or over $1,000, has always been a valuable asset in farming communities. Producing around 15 liters of milk a day, it could feed not just a calf, but also several people throughout the year. And if we look at the Russian Empire, which carried many aspects of medieval society well into modern times, in the year 1905, there were about 39 heads of cattle per 100 people. About 1 in 5 peasants had no cows at all. A family with 4 or 5 cows was considered wealthy. And keep in mind, today's high survival rates for calves and adult cattle rely on antibiotics. Back then, losing livestock was much more common, meaning cattle often ended up as emergency food or raw material for clothing. And when we open up sources like the Salic Law, the Saga of the People from the Sandy Shore, and other Viking Age texts, we see that even something as simple as an axe was worth about the same as a cow. That's expensive. At least if we look at prices through the eyes of an average medieval person, not some nobleman. To put it roughly in today's terms, a few hundred grams of steel shaped into a fairly simple weapon could cost more than 2 modern Kalashnikov rifles. Thanks to industrial production, you can now buy several basic axes for the price of a single day's worth of milk from a cow. And swords? A no-frills, practical one would have set you back 3 to 7 cows, while a fancy gold-inlaid one? Easily more than a dozen. And when you factor in that a chainmail shirt cost more than 10 cows, plus the need for a helmet, other gear, and often a war horse, it becomes clear that a well-equipped medieval warrior was nothing like a modern infantryman. In the fragile medieval economy, even ancient Rome, which was much more developed, had a per capita GDP lower than that of the poorest modern African nations. A fully armed warrior was more like today's heavy military equipment or aircraft. But why were relatively simple metal objects so expensive? One reason was, of course, the weakness of the agrarian economy. Most people had to work the land just to keep the state running at even the most basic level. Skilled craftsmen, and those who could afford their services, were a tiny fraction of the population. And to make good weapons, you had to produce them constantly. So if we're talking about the early or even the high Middle Ages, there were probably only a handful of workshops specializing in sword making. Blades, like the famous Ulfbert swords, found thousands of kilometers from where they were forged, were not an exception. They were the norm. History textbooks are basically the state's way of telling its own story, which usually means focusing on wars. But in reality, standing armies in the Middle Ages were tiny, so weapons remained luxury items that most people simply didn't care about. After all, situations where a cow could save your life were much more common than ones where an axe or a sword would, especially since peasants didn't own the land they worked, despite what some modern narratives suggest. The land belonged to the feudal lord who was responsible for defending it. But aside from exclusivity, the cost of weapons was also driven by the production process. For a long time, one of the main sources of iron ore was bog iron, which, conveniently for the Scandinavians, was plentiful in northern Europe. As you can guess, mining this ore wasn't about swinging a pickaxe, but more like carefully combing through swamp deposits. I can't even imagine how much peat, sludge, and other nasty substances had to be sifted through just to get a few kilos of ore. And even then, ore isn't pure metal, it's a mix of different minerals. 5 or 6 kilograms of ore in a bloomery furnace would produce just a kilogram of wrought iron, which still wasn't pure iron and contained a lot of impurities. So, to keep up even a somewhat regular production of hardened iron goods, you needed a steady supply of hundreds of kilos of ore and charcoal. And while I'm no blacksmith, something tells me that mistakes happened. Some blanks probably got overheated, others ruined in different ways. Plus, apprentices had to learn somehow. By the 14th century, though, things started to change. Weaponry was no longer quite as exclusive. You started seeing cheap, simple blades. Some supposedly cost about as much as 20 liters of ale. That said, professional military gear was still a luxury. Even by the mid-14th century, a basic hand-and-a-half sword would set you back around 40 shillings, roughly the price of 4 cows. The very fact that there was a class of well-armed warriors in the Middle Ages and that their gear remained pricey is, in my opinion, tied to one simple truth. In any war, there are those who do the fighting and those who profit from it. And in the medieval world, those were often the same people. They knew the risks of their trade, so they didn't skimp on equipment, and weaponsmiths made sure to cash in on that.